Okay, so we've moved inside here, and I've tried to find a space that most resembles Bartleby's, well, cubicle. And maybe this story was a way ahead of its time. Now, I don't know how many of you have gone into large office spaces, or what I call cubicle culture, where people have their own little boxes that they work in and have their head buried into a computer every day. But very much resembles the office that the lawyer or our narrator is running here. And hopefully none of you will experience the dehumanizing office spaces of the 21st century. So I don't know about you, but I'm starting to feel like work again. And I was running around trying to do school stuff this morning, organize meetings, Zoom interviews, and I had to just be like, okay, I have to go to class. So here I am in class again, and it's a little rough, but we're gonna see what we can do here. I have your discussion board here on my computer, and I have the book here, and let's see what happens. So one of the first very good questions came from Nicole Kernan, the one on my left. And she says, do you think that Bartleby is trying to give us a deeper meaning into a more serious topic, or are we just reading about this character? P.S. This was one of the most confusing readings to me for some reason. Well, there's a very good reason that it was confusing to Nicole, because it's confusing. The supposed main character, which we want to think is Bartleby because the story is named after him, as I said in my earlier remarks, he's really not the main character, the narrator is. And Bartleby just cannot really be understood. There's always a wall between us and him. This guy, for some reason, feels walled off from the world and is unable to make human connections. Maybe he makes some connection with the narrator because he refuses to leave the office. And the narrator is about as good to him as anyone could expect another person to be. But it is difficult to understand because Bartleby is, well, inscrutable. So, very good question. In many ways, that's the point of the story. Herman Melville is not an easy writer. Herman Melville, his great strength as a great American writer that he is to present a problem, a question, and not give you the answer. And you can spend a lifetime trying to think of the answer. And that's powerful. And he's the best in the business at that. By the way, on a very sort of sad note, Herman Melville had very early great success as a writer of very exotic, even a little erotic travel tales. And then he started to write more deeper literature that nobody really cared for. And then he got a government job in New York City, and for about 20 years left his little apartment, walked down the sidewalk to a bureaucratic job, very similar to what Bartleby has, and walked home and died in relative obscurity. And he wasn't rediscovered for many, many decades later. So one of our first questions on the discussion board came from Rita, and this is a good one. As you were reading, what was going through your head as to what Bartleby might be, or who Bartleby might be? If you were the lawyer in this situation, how would you have handled it? Good questions, Rita. I do remember the first time I read this story thinking, what? This guy, it was funny. I laughed, and I laughed more every time I read it, but I had no idea who he was. I did think of people who he reminded me of. Students in my classes when I was a student who sat in the back of the room and never said anything. Kids in school who never said anything. People who just seemed to be disconnected from everything. So he did remind me of certain people. If I was the lawyer, he handled it as well as he could. The lawyer, however, I think the lawyer's one flaw is he is very concerned about his reputation. throughout. He's very concerned about his reputation. That's why he always plays it safe. He's quite happy that one of the richest men in America at the time sometimes said the lawyer's name. He's going to church one Sunday, the Sunday he discovers Bartleby living in the office. He's going to hear a celebrated preacher, not to have his soul nourished, but a preacher that everyone else wants to hear. He wants to be in on it. Fear of missing out. And what finally gets him to get rid of Bartleby? He puts up with so much, but the thing that finally gets him to get rid of Bartleby, people are talking about him. Other lawyers come to the office and they say, "Scrivener, come here." And he says, "I prefer not to." It's starting to damage his reputation. So for my money, that's the one thing I don't like about him. And I'm not someone who's overly concerned with my reputation. I just try to do the best I can, and the reputation should take care of itself. But I know Bartleby would be very, very frustrating to a lot of people. And I tend to find people like him a little more curious and interesting, I guess. Emma asks, what's the point of the story? We'll work our way back around to that. Kat, what do you think is the significance or meaning? Oh, we'll get to the last line of the story. That'll be our big wrap-up. I like that one a lot. Okay, here's a good comment from Nicole Kernan. She's kind of thinks she's agreeing with herself here, which is always a safe bet. I agree, this was a confusing one for me as well. I think he was friendly because he was there with him, but he needed to be serious. I think that him being afraid of change and moving on could have to do with his childhood, early life, because he may have had it pretty hard to shape him into who he was in the story. Interesting theory, Nicole. I like it a lot. Bartleby is kind of like a kid in this story. And at the very end, which we'll get to at the end, he winds up in a fetal position. So he is almost reverting back to a childlike state. Let's remember, when he shows up at the office, he throws himself into working. He's the best Scrivener the lawyer has ever had. The lawyer gives him a little spot right inside his own office, but with a screen around him. By the way, the only thing I'm missing here is a window. Bartleby had a window that looked out onto you guessed it, a brick wall. So back to Nicole. Yeah, so he is like a kid. He only snacks on food. He never seems to have a full meal. And maybe the most kid-like thing about him, and this may be the most important thing about Bartleby, is his classic line, "I prefer not to." That is a childlike thing. I don't want to. I prefer not to. Why not? Well, I just don't want to. It's also a very mature thing in its own way. Looking for your preferences. What words in the story are compared to preference? And the word will comes up. I will. The narrator says to Bartleby,